introduce yourself and just let us know where you were born, raised, and just like any other information that you think would be relevant?
Yeah, sure. My name's Cody Wilson. I was born and raised in Marion County, West Virginia, just about 30 minutes south of Morgantown, in a really small part of Marion County called Plum Run. So if you would go south to Fairmont and then continue going into the woods for a long time, that's kind of where I was born and raised. I attended WVU starting in 2010, graduated 2014 with a BFA in acting, emphasis in classical drama. I did have an international studies minor started, and I was one class away from finishing that. So hope to go back and eventually finish that. My mother is from Vietnam, half Vietnamese, half Caucasian. My mother was adopted during the Vietnam War, a few weeks before the fall of Saigon. So we don't have any history or knowledge of her family over there, but we have a lot of family throughout West Virginia and Ohio area. I've moved to New York City in 2014, where I started my acting career. It took me to several places. I've worked kind of all across America now. I've worked up the East Coast to upstate New York, as far west as Missouri and Arkansas. I did a lot of work in Washington, D.C. area, and I've been kind of in the city ever since.
Okay, that's so cool. What kind of like, so I'm interested in two things of like what encouraged you to do this interview, but also just like how did you find our Instagram? Because I feel like you found it relatively like fast for us being new.
Yeah, so I'm part of an alumni group specifically associated indirectly with the College of Creative Arts, the theater department. We're a group of alumni looking to spread diversity, equity, inclusion at WVU, as well as sort of connect a network of alumni together. We found that there was a shortcoming graduating WVU, that there wasn't much of a outside communication. Like once you graduated, you were kind of on your own. So we started collecting signatures for a diversity, equity, inclusion awareness. Specifically, there was a moment in the theater industry where people were tackling white-centered theater, and they were trying to figure out if we could reform and reconfigure and just address systematic problems that have been there for a long time.
Mhm.
So we started that out, and then I was looking for other like-minded groups at WVU, just trying to find resources and information and see who was also available there. And then I stumbled on Asian Association, which I thought was personally awesome. When I was at WVU, I felt very isolated and alone, being the only Asian in the acting department. I was even and it put me in situations where I felt even more isolated when it came to certain acting classes and like the material we would choose. So when I saw that, I was just really excited. I was like, oh, how nice is it that there's actually a group of this? And then I saw one of your posts that I really identified with, where it was I forget who it was, but there was a person talking about how they were also raised in West Virginia, and how like white-centered culture just made things complicated, and just trying to figure out what it means to be Asian in West Virginia is just complicated in general. So I just took initiative to try to reach out and make the contact, because when I was there, I would have really liked a group like this. And I mean, I there were so many moments where I was on the PRT and I was like, oh, I'll go to Creative Arts Center, and then every other Asian student that I would see would either go to like medical or engineering, which is great that they're pursuing those careers, but as an artist, I felt completely isolated. I didn't have any much connection with. So just knowing that there's a group now there, I was super jazzed by. And I'm actually mentoring a current musical theater student who is also Asian American. So it's nice full circle of just involvement. I've been trying to be involved with the school.
That's cool. I a lot of our members have like kind of said the same thing just because like so we just got accepted in August, so we're not even like a whole year old yet, but like a lot of
Wow.
them have just said like they feel very like some of them aren't from West Virginia, and like coming here they're like
Mhm.
so surprised at like the lack of like Asian community, so like this kind of like
Yeah.
helps them feel more at home and more comfortable. So I definitely
Well,
think that.
absolutely. Yeah. I think it's
Okay.
just I think it's great that you're also just bringing so many people together. Because yeah, I showed up. I mean, I went to school there, and wow, it was over a decade ago, and there was not any sort of Asian community, and I felt like there were those who were finding community in their majors, but there was no cross sections at all.
Right. Which going on that, like when you were here, since you said you came here in 2010, which is
Mhm.
was a while ago, do you feel like you faced a lot of like prejudice during that time while here on campus
I
at
felt
all?
like there was there's always been this I call it like a tightrope act, right? When you grow up in such a rural area, and I don't want to say closed-minded, but they're definitely not open-minded, and they haven't been exposed to many things. I never felt racial pressure from any faculty or anybody in charge by any means, but there was a level of awareness when it came to the student body. I avoided I avoided the party scene. I avoided areas where I felt basically high street. I avoided downtown high street because it just to an extent would get there would just be moments where I would feel the pressure. Did I ever experience anything directly? Not from anybody on university or campus. Indirectly in my just everyday living in Morgantown or living in West Virginia. Yeah, I did.
Okay. Um, and then so in what ways do you feel that your like parents or even your culture kind of shaped your identity today? And was there any internal struggles you had to like face while growing up here? And how did you kind of like overcome that? Good
It's
question.
no, yeah, big question, but it's actually very fitting to be asked that at this moment because I mentioned that I'd been working on this play
Right.
about my mother's immigration story. My mom has never really liked to say out loud that she is Vietnamese. She doesn't like accepting it because doing so just means that she's in fact different than the white family that adopted her. Growing up, we never talked about it, we never mentioned it, and so no one ever addressed it to me. It wasn't until I got to WVU when I started filling out forms when they were asked, "What's your race?" And I would be confused by the question. Because I'm like, well, yeah, I'm Asian, but I'm not Asian. Like, I'm not culturally or heritage or familial. I'm not even familiar with the idea of being what it means to be Asian American. So when I got to college, it was the first time that I really started embracing that and started figuring out that as part of my identity. And I think the biggest hurdle that I had during that time is that I had spent 18 years whitewashing myself as best I could, visually, clothing, anything I could do just to make myself feel more assimilated to West Virginia. But as I get older, and since moving to New York City and witnessing the world over the past couple of years, there's been this really awesome awakening of like pride and like encouragement and awareness. And I've taken more and more classes on diversity, equity, inclusion to just kind of learn how to be an ally in certain situations. But even more like I love knowing that Asian American doesn't just it's such a broad umbrella that no one wants to give as much time to think about. It's like a huge spectrum of like what that means. Like if you're an immigrant on day one, you're Asian American, but you could have been here for 30 years trying to figure it out and it's still part of your identity. So I guess like it took um it took separation from my mom because she never liked to talk about stuff. And it also took kind of like research and an investigation on community. Like I had to like it was weird. I had to find Asian friends. I didn't have Asian friends growing up. There were three Asian students in my high school out of a body of about 800, and we didn't talk to each other, which seemed weird to me.
I think that's interesting what you were saying about like how you had to kind of separate yourself from your mom, just because one of like a very common thing is like generations, like the young generation versus the older generation of Asian Americans, and it's just
Hmm.
like they tend to be like, I'm Asian, I don't have to be like proud about it, I'm just Asian, you know. But
Yeah,
whereas there's like this new movement of like younger generations that are like, no, we need to be proud, we need to be like loud, we need to like speak up for ourselves, you know. So I always think
100%.
that's interesting.
Yeah, I felt like it was for like 20 years it was factual. It was like you're Asian, but it was never embracing it. It was never like
Hmm.
pride at all. And I love that. I mean, even if it's only been 10 years, like I mean, we're not really generations apart, but like your generation is cultivating that. Like you guys are creating a community at WVU, which definitely did not do that while I was there. And like without you all, probably wouldn't be done at all. Um, it would, and it's one of those generational things where it has to come from the younger one. Like the students are the ones proactively building a community when you would think it would be. I remember when I was there, I was taking an Asian cinema class, and I thought it was like one of the coolest classes there was. And I would talk to the teacher, and I got the same reception from her. She was like I was isolated, and my Asian religious teacher was a white guy named Mr. Snow. So I was wondering where everybody was. Um,
Right.
so knowing that it's continued to be a thing. And another thing, this is just a small tangent on WVU, they do a great job pulling, I would say, talent and like scholastic talent into like engineering and medical, but then they don't announce it. They don't champion these people coming from other countries to WVU.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know what your experience has been like involving other schools at the university, but that's just what I saw when I was there.
I think WVU has definitely like tried a little harder. I don't know, did you guys have like the uh, Division of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the time when you were here?
I don't think at the time I remember there was diversity awareness was the kind of the term they had because
Hmm.
there's festivals and things like where they celebrate the international community where it's usually in the mountaineer layer where they have like a table of everybody's food or and then like
Yeah.
there's like clubs and stuff like that, but it wasn't this proactive approach of like we need to make sure every department everywhere is aware of what's going on.
I think so for this DDEI, I think they have started incorporating it into the colleges, and
Hmm.
some sororities have even gotten DDEI chairs in their sororities.
I actually
So
saw that on a post somewhere.
yeah,
I thought that was so cool that
so
sororities.
it is slowly like I think getting better, but I do agree with you in the sense of like it's still not like reaching everybody. Like, you know, even the people that need to hear it and see it, I feel like aren't being reached yet. So
I think
still
there's a lot
stuff
of
to happen.
they're doing that surface level thing where you get to
Right.
see what's going on, but there's not that depth that needs to be out. Like sports, I know like they're not aware of anything, even though
Yeah.
they get all the money in the world, they're not aware of anything.
Yeah. But so, and then I kind of wanted to move on to like what you're doing now. So in
Sure.
your email to me, you mentioned that before the pandemic, you were working on, off Broadway on the show called Handbagged. Would
Hmm.
you like to kind of like explain a little bit more of like how you got to that, what you did, and just any experience from it?
Yeah, sure. I thought that was definitely the height of what I was achieving at the time before the pandemic ended. And the way it kind of worked itself out was a pinball effect. I went to this place called Hudson Valley Shakespeare Festival, where I was in a play that transferred to Washington, D.C. And while I was in Washington, D.C., I auditioned for this new play that they were trying to do. And it is when we did it, it was the um, premiere of it in the States. It had only ever been in London and West End. There was this Indian director named Indu Singham, if I'm saying that correctly, Singham. Um, and one of the things that they were searching for was an actor of color. More specifically, they wanted an Asian actor of color, which I thought was really, helpful at the time. So we started that play in Washington D.C. and it was very political. It was very much like another thing that was crazy about it was at the time, Queen Elizabeth was still alive when we were doing it. So her death kind of like shifted the play a little bit, but we were in DC and it was so political. It was like Queen Elizabeth, who was basically the blue Democratic side of the argument, and then this woman named Margaret Thatcher, who was an intense, really right-winged lady in the UK. So in DC, the play shot up just because everything in there is political. And then when we transferred to off Broadway, we had the same reception where it became this political conversation and awareness. And the craziest thing about the moment was this transitioning moment into Trump mania and having Trump into the White House, and how the political scene in the theater world was at its height. And I felt like that in itself was its biggest achievement. I thought that the play did a really, ironically, my role was actor one, but I had to play like a series of people. And I thought it was very effective because my character was the only person of color ever challenging what was being said on stage. Like like they talked about coal mining riots and things, and they were like, oh, it was no big deal, it's no big deal, and they tried to push it up. And then the one person of color was like, actually, these people were suppressed and these people were isolated and prosecuted, and it became kind of a message of those who are quieted got to be loud for a second. So that was probably my favorite part about the play.
Interesting. So how long were you like, how long did that go on for you, kind of?
So I did the original production was in 27 to 2018. Like we started
Mhm.
rehearsing in February, and then or we started rehearsing somewhere towards like December was when we got the script. And then we put it up, I believe, in the February slot. And then 2019, the following summer, we took about 9 months off because there was other productions involved. But then that came back in 2019 in June. So 2.5 to 3 years of developing it. And the play had changed a little bit with certain rewrites and edits and things like that.
That's still really awesome though. And it's cool you got to be part
Yeah.
of it. Like yeah.
It
Um,
was, and it's a huge scope too, because I mean, growing up on a farm in West Virginia, I never thought that I'd be off Broadway in New York City. So it had a large arc to the story.
no, but I think that makes it even more like inspiring though too. I'm also
Thank
from
you.
West Virginia. Do you know where Brooke County is?
Yeah, I do.
So that's where I'm from. I'm also adopted, so it's just like I get it. So like that's super
Oh,
inspiring.
so your family, you were adopted from
Yeah,
what is your nationality?
I'm adopted from China.
Oh.
So I completely understand growing up like, in a small town. So I think that's really awesome though that you had that opportunity.
I
Oh,
mean, I'm inspired knowing that you didn't have any connection to it, and yet you're still finding this
thank
identity
you.
with it. That's really awesome.
Yeah. Thank you.
You're
Um,
welcome.
but moving to the work you're doing right now, like the
Hmm.
one man show that you're trying to write, the Did My Grandfather Kill My Grandfather?
Hmm.
When you emailed me about that and I read it, I was like, that sounds really interesting and probably has like a lot of layers to it. So
Mm.
would you like to describe anything else more about it? Just like what's your
Yeah.
process? What was like you had to deal with like in writing it and coming up with this?
Well, ironically, and this is in the play, and if you'd like, I'm more than comfortable sending you a copy. It hasn't been published or anything. It's still
Yeah.
in the beginning process. I'll definitely send it to you. Right now, it's in the process of being submitted to like under 1 hour play festivals is what I'm hoping to. I just submitted to this company called Pan Asian Repertory, that's in New York City, ran by a really awesome Asian American woman who's just killing it. I mean, she's been on the scene since I think like 1970, like breaking boundaries, and she's now like got this company. I'm fingers crossed. Um, but in the play, the question, did my grandfather kill my grandfather, really started when I was like 5 or 6, when I was in school. And I had the first person who was a kid be like, "You're Asian." I was like, "What are you talking about? I don't understand what that means." So I asked my mom, and my mom didn't give me many details. And eventually I asked my grandparents, and I found out over several years of talking to people that my white grandfather did 3 tours in Vietnam. And that war in itself was really violent and misguided, and the information behind it was bad. So when I got to high school, I unfortunately had the circumstance where there was a teacher who was on the negative side of things, treated me negatively, viewed me negatively. And I really started questioning things like right away from the textbook. So this is when I graduated in 2010. So this would have been like 2009, 2008. That's the turn of the century, right? The textbook in itself only categorized Vietnamese as heinous, as the bad guy, the enemies. And so, like, as a 17-year-old, I was imprinted with this image of like, I'm meant to be bad. Like,
Right.
it makes people who say things to me negatively are justified because of what I was told that my people did to Americans, right? So I realized at the time, I was like, well, I have absolutely no knowledge of my Vietnamese family. What is the potential or the possibility that my white grandfather shot and killed my other grandfather? Which, like, in a grand scheme of things, obviously the likelihood is very small. But as a 17-year-old having a racial identity crisis, like, I came to that conclusion. So I started writing this play, I'd say like 2, 3 years ago, trying to figure out what it even meant for me to be Asian American, what it meant for my mom and my family. And it was this really tough um, internal discussion. And I think the worst part was like there was no one to talk to anybody. My older sister doesn't, she's a first grade teacher, and she's on the train of awareness, and talking to her has been excellent. But during the time, there was no one to talk to. I had a white family that could not identify with me, and I had a younger brother who was too young to be having the discussion with. So I kind of sat in it for years, all the way through college. There were moments in college where we have we have a voice teacher that would teach us how to speak, essentially. And I used to talk with like a really bad accent, like a really bad hick twang. Like it was really rough. So when I got to college, she was like, "What's going on with you? Why do you sound like you're a redneck, even though you're Asian?" And it was just this whole. I was like, I felt offended by the question, and I was like, "Well, can you help me sound Asian in case I need it?" And she said, "No, I don't know how to do that." So even through college, I was completely isolated and trying to figure out what it meant to be Asian. So and then I got to New York City, and everyone kind of said the same thing. They were like, "That story's crazy. Well, you should write something about it." And I was like, "I guess I should, but this is the first peer group that's ever received it in a way that encouraged me to tell other people." I was always like, "This is just my story. I'm an American that happens to be Asian, and circumstance put me there, but I was never Asian American." And so it's been a long, I'd say like 5 years of me figuring out what it meant to be Asian, finding the pride in it, and then putting it to paper. Because the first time I wrote it was a family drama with my family involved. And it was like my mom's baby story, like the time when she was adopted as a baby, and then when she transitioned when she was like 15, and hearing the stories that she had to go through when she was 15, not great, just overall. So it's been even though that it was better when I was growing up there, it still hasn't really gotten to the point where I think it should be. Um, but yeah, the story in itself is a question of when I was 6, I asked that question to my grandfather, kill my grandfather. Then I was 17, and then then I was in my mid-20s, and I was still hung up on this idea of, am I the bad guy? Is my grandpa the bad guy? Who's the bad guy here? Is anybody the bad
Right.
guy? It just in it there's not really a resolution in the play. I
Hmm.
basically get to tell my story, and it's like I don't get a resolution, so neither does the audience. And I think
Right.
that's the tough part about being Asian American sometimes.
I think I love that just because I know like America is full of a lot of kids that are adopted and or just like that have these stories of like growing, or not even just adopted, but that are from these very like rural areas. And it is such a
Mhm.
different lifestyle growing up surrounded by people that don't look like you versus growing up in a like a more richer, not richer like in money, but like more richer in diversity city that has like,
Sure.
you know, community for you. And I know a lot of my members have talked to me about like the same issues of like identity and just facing that during middle school and high school versus college. So I think that what you're doing is important and needs to be heard, even if there isn't
Thank
like
you.
a like, you know, an actual resolution to the story, but it's still just the story that needs to be more heard from people. So I
Absolutely.
love that idea. I
I
was
think
wondering, oh, sorry.
I was just gonna tell you one more thing because like going off of this identity thing, I found a really good friend. Her name's Kimberly Chatterjee. She's half Caucasian, half Indian, and she almost had like a reverse circumstance. She grew up in California in the Bay Area, right?
Hmm.
Tons of diversity everywhere. She had her Indian grandparents who cooked her the food, who taught her, you know, some of the culture, but they didn't practice, right? And she had always felt more Caucasian than Indian or Asian American. And on the flip side, she had a best friend in high school who was very white and very Jewish, who married an Indian woman, who now practices the culture and is like fully submerged in it. And she's had the conversation with him like, are you more Indian or am I more Indian? And it's
Right.
like, it's hard not to compare, but it's like the only thing that we're told as how to justify how much of a thing you are. Like, oh,
It,
these people
yeah,
do all these things. Are you still in that? I'm like, not
it's such,
really.
it's such a rich topic, you know, that
Hmm.
whole conversation. I was just interested, like, I don't know if this is too much to ask, but like, have you, so is your mother like helping you writing this like at all? Is like, is she on board with it?
No.
How? No.
Um, that that's a great question. You know, it's funny. My mom has always been ultra sensitive about her immigration, and
Hmm.
just she almost puts up a wall the second you try to bring it up. I tried to have a conversation with her once about how proud of I was of her, of just like, you came from this place and you lived in this place and you're still doing it, and like you didn't let anything stop you. And her first reaction was like, what do you mean I'm from where? And it's like, okay, well, she is unable to receive it openly. So I've had to take the conversation to other family members. Specifically, her older brother, my uncle, he was
Hmm.
14 at the time she was adopted. So I kind of developed the play through his lens because he got
Okay.
to tell me about like when she was adopted, what it felt like when she came home, what happened as she got older. He was able to actually give me details. I am looking forward and scared of the moment where I get to share this with her on stage because I'm not entirely sure what her reaction will be. And it's truthfully because she went through so much trauma. You know,
Right.
she didn't have an ounce of whatever we're doing. She didn't have an ounce of conversation about it. Like, anytime an outside person mentioned my mom's ethnicity, her parents shut it down aggressively. We're just like, don't ever bring that up ever again. She's our daughter. That's it. But it's
Right.
like, that's kind of important to talk about, you know? So
Yeah.
unfortunately, she's not fully aware of the circumstance.
Well, I hope when that happens, everything works out for you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, I was thinking about how there's like in today, you know, society, there is a lot more compelling Asian narratives going on in the media. And being in the arts yourself, are there any works that have really resonated with you that are already out there?
Yeah, yeah. There were a couple that I've really resonated with. When I first got into the thing, this is a small thing. My first professional job was Miss Saigon, a
Oh,
Vietnamese musical, right?
right.
Ironically, I was so ignorant at the time that I didn't realize it was a musical and I didn't sing. Here's the kicker though. When I auditioned for it, they were very adamant about like, we want you in the play for obvious reasons now. But they never mentioned that it was singing. And I was like, a Vietnamese story? That sounds awesome. But after that, I found there's this, I forget the play right now name right now. This play that I've been chasing is called Viet Gone. And it is kind of an immigration tale of how Vietnamese soldiers assisted American soldiers and now are driving on a motorcycle across country to find this man's Vietnamese wife who immigrated as well. So it's kind of like a love story. There's another one called Allegiance that George Takei helped that I saw on Broadway about the Japanese internment camps that I thought was really motivating. Um, the sticking point to a lot of Asian narratives, and I can, there's another playwright that I can't recall off the top of my head who's advocating for a lot of this now. The big sticking point is in our industry, people are advocating casting more than the stories themselves. So people are trying to get more Asian Americans into their cast as opposed to
Mhm.
having Asian Americans tell their story. So we're still fighting for our moment on stage, I feel like. I
Right, to
think that
still be
there
heard.
are, yeah, like it happens here and there, and that's amazing. But what's the problem now is, let's take New York, for example, right? You have an Asian American show who does really well in a small theater, right? That typically doesn't get to transfer to Broadway or off Broadway just because it's not going to sell enough tickets. But then you have the other side of the coin where that show that should be relocated to, like, let's say Pennsylvania or Ohio or somewhere that can spread awareness, they don't do that either because there's not enough Asians there to buy the tickets. So we're
Right,
still stuck in this loop of not actually being heard, I feel like.
right, yeah. I completely agree with that. I was also just thinking, like, when you do get your story out and stuff, please continue to hit up the Asian Association at WVU. We would love to
Mm.
like promote it for you and stuff in any way we can and support you. That was just a
And
tiny reminder that I had. That's like one of the things we
that
wanted to
is
do for alumni.
that's so amazing to hear because even my theater department doesn't want the story enough, which is really kind of a downs. I'm the one Asian guy that you've had graduating
And you're
20
not even,
years, not
yeah.
even aware.
So that was, I know, one of my primary goals when I like made this organization is I just wanted it to be a platform for Asian voices just because I just feel being heard and seen when you're not is so important for us, you know?
Mm,
So,
absolutely. I want to
but
let you know that I still have family in Fairmont, like just 20 minutes south, and I visit,
Mhm.
pretty regularly. So if there's ever a moment where I can be at a meeting or, I can share it live or Zoom or whatever it is, like I'm in this. Like if you're looking for alumni to be involved and like have influence in some kind, know that I'm here for it.
Yeah, we would love that, definitely. I can, yeah, I'll talk to my other officers about that. We would probably love that, yeah.
Great, thank you.
Um, so I also had kind of like switching topics a little bit, just to like with the rise in anti-Asian sentiment over like the past few years, especially due to the pandemic and stuff. Has this affected your personal, how has this affected your personal experience over the years in your personal field and stuff? And now that you're older and stuff, has it changed at all?
Yeah, I would say that it's definitely changed. There was, combined with COVID, fear was just too common.
Hmm.
And I knew that it shouldn't be like this. I shouldn't be walking around and being scared. And I think what hit home most for me was my mom, because my mom, she's in Florida now. Um, and she never wants to identify herself as Asian, but even more so then. So she like doubled down on it because she was like, people find out I'm Asian, they're going to come for me.
Right.
I think that what's really sad is that I had bridged a point of self-doubt. I had gotten over this hump of identity, and I was like, I'm an Asian American and it's awesome and that's who I am. And I felt, I mean, not to be too like, I felt beautiful, I felt powerful. And then it got taken. Sorry, it got taken really fast. And I think that's what happened to everybody. is that we didn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
Wow, sorry.
No,
Um,
you're good. You're good.
Thank you, Tess. Um, we didn't do anything, and it got taken really fast. And I think being in New York was helpful and also more terrifying because yes, we're more diverse here, but there is also twice as many unaccepting people, ironically. And I relocated outside of New York during the pandemic for a lot of reasons, but I relocated outside. And ironically, Long Island feels like a flat West Virginia in some places. And all of a sudden, I felt all these eyes all over again. For a long when I moved to New York, I felt very happy because I felt unseen. And then I came out here and I was like a neon light. And I just felt it coming at me from every angle, from every person all the time. And the only thing that really healed it was time and learning some tools on how to deal with it. And I was very fortunate in my regards of not being a victim of any sort of hate, but it was sad how much preparation that I needed to feel safe, you know?
Right. Mentally, like, yeah.
And like, again, it's like, I think back to my mom more specifically, and there were, I mean, dozens of Asian attacks in New York City. And like, so many of them were women, and it just made me sick. And
Yeah,
I was
especially the
like,
elderly.
yeah. And it's just like, there was all this rage that I couldn't do anything about. Like I wanted to go out and, if I could if I could have been like the Asian superhero running around and like protecting people, I wanted to do that. But there's just all this directed anger towards us. And I just feel even more aware of when an Asian woman is just walking in the street. Like that you shouldn't feel threatened, especially here in America. Like that's not how it should work here ever.
Right.
Um, it has affected me. I would say that in the industry, luckily, theatrically, everyone's very accepting and open. I do think that the biggest resistance my industry has is when people of color address issues and the white people in power get defensive and don't want to accept that they're to blame. So that's the wall that I'm trying to knock down.
I completely understand that.
Yeah.
So, in a hopeful light, then, what are some of your hopes and concerns for the AAPI community moving forward? This can be just in America or maybe just even in West Virginia. Like any hopes you'd like to see?
Well, one of them's being accomplished just by your group. Like knowing that we're unified is really powerful. And I've always felt like there was a division among Asian Americans. You're Chinese American, you're Japanese American, you're Vietnamese American. I'm like,
Right.
why are we also putting up walls?
Hmm.
I think that there should be inclusion on our own terms, And again, that's another generational thing. And I'm not trying to knock this from anybody's parents or anything, but like I know Chinese parents, grandparents who don't like Chinese or Japanese grandparents. And like that generational complication is stopping our momentum even more. And I
Yeah.
think if we're unified more, if we're sharing stories more, if we're pushing more, we're always taught to be what is that stereotype they tell us? We're the other white minority. We're like the nice,
The
polite white minority.
model minority.
Model minority. I'm tired of hearing that. Like I want us to be just as much present as we are heard. And I think if not aggression, but con, consistency and what's the word I want? Determination. I lose my determination if I get knocked down a lot, and I feel like a lot of us do. And I
Hmm.
think the determination to be heard is coming through more and more and more.
Okay, that's awesome. So I think ending this on a light note, is there anything or just any advice too you want to give to any of our Asian students at WVU right now?
Yeah. It, it gets easier. um, um, my biggest advice is stop looking around and start looking in. Because there's so often, and this is for everybody who feels marginalized, I feel we look around and the first reaction is to compare. Like, stop putting a mirror up against other people and just like realize what's beautiful about yourself. Realize what gifts you have to share, what awesome stories you have to tell. Um, realize that you're a special person to communities. Like I always felt special because I was like, I am your one Asian friend. Ha 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 ha. And then like I was a best man. I graduated with this guy named Nick Science from theater area, and I was in his wedding on his line. And he's from Maryland, and he had like two or three other Asian guys there. And I was like, "What are you doing? Like, I was supposed to be the one Asian guy on your bachelor's." But then I found out how beautiful it was. I was like, "Oh, the broader my awareness is of the world, the more people I get to connect with, and especially Asian Americans, and especially any people of color, marginalized communities. I just think it gets easier. West Virginia kind of sometimes makes it foggy. The picture seems foggy, and it seems like you're never going to get through this fog of like, where am I at in the world? Where can I feel comfortable? Where can I find a community? And like WVU feels huge, but ultimately it's very small. Like the second you step outside of that world, you'll start realizing, oh, I'm not alone. I just made myself feel alone because of my circumstance. And I think that, this group, hopefully other groups, if they can also provide those places of community, just grow your community. It'll get easier the more your community grows.
Awesome. Well, that's all the questions I had for today. Thank you so much for talking to us about your experience and stuff.
Of course. Thank
I
you,
think
Tess. Yeah.
this is so